Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we are going to talk about what's that shell doing there? Shellos! Isn't it cute? Well, this Pokemon sure knows how to be adorable and competitive at the same time. Now, there's not much to talk about it competitively because it's pretty mediocre as with most pre-evolved Pokemon, but it eventually grows into this monstrosity of a Gastrodon, gaining the ground type through evolution, thereby sporting a very coveted dual typing. The water-ground combination only has just one weakness, a 4 times weakness to grass. Otherwise, it is pretty solid against everything else. It even has an immunity to electric to boot. Coupled with its innate bulk from its base stats, Gastrodon fills the role of a tank in competitive play. But make no mistake, my friends, this water slug has more to it than just absorbing attacks. Because it has a good coverage of offensive options as well. It takes advantage of its dual typing to get stabbed on really powerful moves, spread moves such as Earthquake and Muddy Water. Earthquake being less seen because it's a physical move. So you really want to invest all your EVs and IVs into special attack rather than spread them between special and physical. You also have the Trusty Skull to potentially burn some physical sweepers. But beyond that, it also has offensive options in other typings as well, most notably Ice type. Ice Beam is a very key, powerful move for going toe-to-toe against the likes of Garchomp without being Ice type yourself, which leaves yourself very vulnerable to a lot of attacks. Finally, due to the bulk of Gastrodon, we have to consider the Toxic Recover combo as an offensive option as well, being able to whittle down opponent Pokemon, so long as they don't have the offensive power to subdue Gastrodon quickly enough. The offensive coverage of Gastrodon is a really powerful aspect and the reason why it's pretty competitive, but here's where Gastrodon really shines in. It poses a latent threat to the enemy player, not just the Pokemon, the player themselves. Gastrodon is most effective outside of the battle, more so than on the battlefield itself. I know this sounds crazy, but a suitable Netrunner analogy would be the Clawed threat. Clawed is more threatening when you don't see it, when there's an SMC or a Peddler on the board and you don't know if it's coming or not. In this matchup you see in the graphic, we have the blue versus the orange player, and the orange player has to keep in mind that at any time the blue player can potentially switch Gastrodon into the battle, which potentially nullifies moves such as electric moves, which are instantly thwarted since they are absorbed by Gastrodon. So this is something that affects the way the orange player plays, which is always an advantage, disrupting the gameplay. Not only that, however, besides electric type, because of one of Gastrodon's abilities, which is Storm Drain, this type absorption also applies to water type moves. So the orange player here, for example, has a Politoed circled right there. This is a pure water type Pokemon and usually delivers very powerful water type moves, but they can be instantly absorbed the moment Gastrodon swapped in. So this is a really, really powerful counter and something that the orange player has to be constantly aware of every single turn. And this is the power of latent threat in Pokemon. Let's see this matchup in action, shall we? So here's an example from VGC 2017. On the near side, we have Goodra and Celesteela versus Politoed and Tapu Bulu on the far side. Now, on the near side, it seems like there's no threat at all. You can safely use Politoed's water ability coupled with the rain that's up to deal some serious damage with a water-based move such as Scald. But as you see here, the near side player swapped out the Celesteela for a Gastrodon, and suddenly everything changes. Politoed at this point right now attempts to use Scald, but here, Storm Drain activates and Gastrodon absorbs the attack, gains special attack. That's awesome, but of course, the joy is short-lived as suddenly a Horn Leech comes out from Tapu Bulu. Oops, 4 times damage. Gastrodon, 1-hit KO. Well, that's the single point of weakness right there. Grass-type moves. Gastrodon, no likey. Alright, I know what you're thinking right now. What does Shellos and its evolution have to do with Los? Well, some of the points I said actually do apply to Los as well. Los has a reasonable number of offensive options in faction. Just like Gastrodon, it also poses a latent threat to the core, and this is actually quite a powerful aspect of Los, because you can kind of predict what's in the deck. D-res stuff. Finally, it also suffers from a single point of weakness. So let's look into those in a bit of detail. It has a lot of offensive options, being in the blue faction. Cards like Account Siphon, Sneak Door Beta, and Inside Job all give you a route to pressure the core and slow down their setup. Of particular note is Sneak Door Beta, which I think has to be played in any deck that begins out as Los. Sneak Door Beta gives you the accesses you need early to gain an early game advantage, just like Gabriel Santiago. Even though you don't get the 2 credits that Gabe does from HQ runs, you still force Ice Reses because they need to defend against the Sneak Door, and this gives you money as well as Los. So I think Sneak Door is a very important include, not to mention that as someone who wants to de-res Ice, you'll be using Emergency Shutdown a lot, which we'll be talking about in the next slide. So having a second route into HQ to activate Emergency Shutdown is very key. The latent threat is the key point of Los. Because you will be expecting de-res effects cards like Shutdown, Crescentus, Exploit from Los. This really changes how you play as the Corp. Some Ice suddenly become more effective, others become a lot less. You really don't want to be spending 14 credits to res a Curtain Wall when it's rather trivial for them to de-res with Emergency Shutdown. So this changes the viability of Ice as the Corp, and if the Los player suddenly installs a Crescentus, you might have to think twice when they start running your servers. You might not want to res that DNA tracker after all, if it bankrupts you and leaves you vulnerable to other vectors of attack. So yes, Los with his myriad of ways to de-res Ice will change the way you place your Ice, will change how viable your Ice are as the Corp, and this inevitably changes how you evaluate your board state as well. And this is something you have to take advantage of when you're constructing a Los deck. Finally, we have to mention Los's weaknesses. As mentioned in my earlier video, where I claim that starting with Andromeda is just better. One of the big reasons is because you can't really deal very well with Corps whose game plan is to only have very few Ice, but potent Ice at that. One of the biggest counters I can think of is Gagarin Deep Space. Gagarin has Ice that is really annoying for Los. Cards like Tour Guide and Hive are cheap to res, but very taxing for Los to get through. They can attempt to de-res it, but it's rather trivial for the Corp to re-res them. Not to mention that in such a Gagarin deck, it's usually the assets that do the talking, and Los cannot really keep up with assets in the same way Andromeda can. Therefore, these are decks that just completely crush Los. This is why we need to preserve the Desperado Temujin Econ engine. Even though we are not playing a fully run-based deck, we still need these powerful cards to give us at least some sort of a fighting chance against Ice Light decks. And this is how I'm building my Los today. Let's see it in action, shall we? Well, Temujin is a crutch. It's such a crutch that there's no reason not to play in every deck, and this is no exception. Like, I'm going to start with double Temujin opening. Well, since my opponent doesn't Ice Archives here, I'm just going to liberate lots of money off. I'll be in a lot worse of a position if my opponent actually found a third piece of Ice. That just goes to show you how crazy Temujin is. But this is not a rant on Temujin, this is a Los game versus ETF. Let's see how this goes. My opponent double draw with Jackson, doesn't find any Ice. Maybe they do, but it's too late. I'm going to be able to liberate this entire Temujin. First is a run on Archives that triggers Temujin and triggers Jackson as well. Can't complain about that. Then I get a Compromise and play out. Compromise is very interesting. It doesn't provide the same amount of economic power as Temujin does, but synergizes pretty well with Los and all the de-res effects. So I'm going to play it here. It also shores up one of your weaknesses in Traces, so that helps as well. I'm going to run through the Eli here and try to launch campaign. Very curious that this ETF player is running launch campaign in HB. There are typically a lot of better options than launch. Alright, so my opponent goes for a second Ice on Eli and an install on what I presume is an agenda. Now you'll notice in my opening hand I did start out with Sneak Door Beta as well, and this is something I'm going to look to leverage on shortly. But first I want my opponent to draw a couple more cards because I know they reshuffled a bunch of agendas with Jackson earlier on. So now that they have drawn a bunch of cards that must be agendas, I'm going to install Sneak Door and make 2 HQ runs. I spent one click to also install a Temujin director at HQ. This allows me to liberate 2 agendas in my 2 runs and get 8 money at the same time. Now I'm filthy rich and I'm halfway towards winning. I'm forcing my opponent to rest the vanilla here on archives. Since that's a very easy ice to bounce off, I can use special order to get in again. I had to decide between Faust and NT. I decided on NT here because I feel like I'm going to make a lot of sneak door runs and I'd rather be spending 1 credit than a card to get through archives. So yes, this is another thing that you would probably have noticed if you thought about my opening hand. Why am I running E3 feedback implants? And the answer is my main breaker for this deck is Faust. I've been agonizing over the breaker suite with which to use for Los, and my final conclusion was that you have to play Faust. I mean, you don't have to, but it seems like the best option. Because Los typically runs out of tempo very quickly and doesn't have very good card draw. So you want to play cards like Drug Dealer and Faust to fuel your runs as opposed to using real money, because you will run out of money faster than Run Base Andromeda, for example. So I'm going to force a Fairchild 3 res here. One of the nice things about playing against HB is that you don't have to worry so much about big ice because you can simply click through them as long as you sneak door first click. So I was able to click through the Fairchild and fetch a Chronos project on top of it. That's very nice for 2 reasons. Firstly, I run Levy in this deck. Chronos will be a hard counter. Secondly, it brings me to match point. My opponent is in a very bad spot right now, and I can actually basically sit back, relax, and enjoy the scenery. Slowly set up my board state, let my opponent score a couple of agendas, and then go for a Hail Mary run later on. So now my objective is to find some sort of central multi-access. I'm going to dig for it. I don't find it, but I do find an emergency shutdown, so I'm going to set up for it by installing Faust E3. Between these 2 cards, I should be able to get through most of my opponent's ice, and my goal right now is to de-res the most expensive ice on the board, which is Fairchild 3. Meanwhile, my opponent scores, finally getting a corporate sales team off. This is not the agenda I wanted to see. Sales team is quite good for my opponent because it allows them to res a lot of ice. So I need to take advantage of this window while they are poor, while the sales team money is still on the agenda, to make some successful central runs and get the D-res going. So first step, run HQ. Running HQ allows me to access a card from HQ, trigger the last of Temujin, and then I can shut the Fairchild down. Next step, run the remote to trash the Sand. Unfortunately, my opponent is well prepared for this. With exactly 4 credits, they keep me out with the Turing. Otherwise, if they weren't able to res ice, I would simply click and credit through Eli because E3 is that good, and demolish my opponent's scoring remote. Turing keeps me out, so the next best thing I can do is to actually trash the team sponsorship. But I figure that with 0 credits, my opponent cannot score next turn, so I should be safe leaving the team spawn for a turn. I'm going to run R&D and try to get lucky. I see a helium beta test. Right? So no dice there. Game moves on. My opponent gets a few credits. What do I do here? Trashing team sponsorship is a big priority. I do not want my opponent recurring anything from the bin. So I draw a couple of cards, I see a passport, but no memory to install the passport. Passport would be nice for getting through the Fairchild. It's not going to happen this time. I'm going to trash the team spawn instead. And another thing I could have done here was to run the remote and trash the Sand. My biggest worry with that is that after clicking through the entire Turing, I would be left with no clicks to deal with whatever ice was behind it. An Architect or a second Turing would be super annoying to deal with. So I decided to just let the remote go at this point. Besides, my opponent has a launch campaign in there, so that's hogging the remote if they have to choose between money and scoring agendas, which is fine with me. I can spend the rest of my time setting up. Again, I'm trying to look for multi-access here because getting single accesses on runs is a lot worse now. With my opponent getting richer, I can't afford to sneak door and pay 3 clicks through Fairchild 3. That's too much of a tempo loss for me. I can only do this if I'm confident I can get a same old emergency shutdown off, which is why I installed the same old thing here. I wanted to go for a shutdown right here so that I can regain some tempo. Opponent ices R&D. Alright. So what do I do here? My large economy lead is still there for the most part. I have 16 credits, but now my opponent is rich as well. I have to respect any ice reses that come my way. Architects are also a big worry because I don't have Mongoose installed. I go for a sneak door here. It's a Fairchild 3 that I know. I'd rather do this than to face 2 unknown ice on HQ. So I ditch 3 cards here and paid 2 credits with E3 to get a single HQ access. No dice with the agendas, but I do get to shut down the Fairchild 3 again. So that felt quite good, but I was only treading water at best. Because my opponent in the meantime had enough money, gained enough resources to score the next agenda. with a biotech label, they get a sales team out, and this means they have even more money to access two sales teams. Goodness me! So I'm going to take advantage of some of that money myself with a siphon. Gonna click through the Ichi, and my opponent isn't able to rest the inner ice, so I get to siphon for 6 credits. You usually won't trigger the siphon here as criminal, but because I have Aaron counters, I could do this without much tempo loss. Now, I'm able to force my opponent to 0 credits. This is what you want to do as loss. Credit denial, bring them to 0 credits so you get free R&D runs. I'm going to see a Sansan here. I knew that I was not going to contest the Sansan remote, so I left the Sansan there, which would be pretty blank to my opponent. The other reason I don't really want to trash the Sansan, the rare Sansan in the remote, is because if I do, most likely my opponent will play Friends in High Places to recur it. And they are pretty rich with the 2 sales team squad, so that could be a mistake. I mean, trashing Sansans is very important, you really should try to do it. But I knew that I had no solution, no permanent solution for the Turing on the remote. Being AI based, Turing is one glaring weakness, and yeah, that is something I have to concede to my opponent. What I'm trying to do here is to assault centrals until I win, and I should be able to do that. Theoretically, being on 5 agenda points, this seems like something I should be able to do, but I haven't been able to gain tempo. Breaking ice is very difficult because I'm spending clicks to draw instead of getting free draw, but from my 3 drug dealers, which finally one has finally arrived. So now I'm starting to draw my redundant cards like my Desperados, so I can now start breaking ice. My opponent does a new install on the remote, and this has me worried. Biotic labor into 4 advancements will win my opponent the game if that agenda is global food. So I need to be really careful here. I do want to install the Desperado, so that's something I definitely should do. I contemplated running the remote because that could be an agenda. Lots of decisions to make, but I chose, again, to stick with my guns and go for R&D. Is this a mistake? Possibly. But I just didn't want to lose tempo from being baited into a remote run. And besides, my opponent's too poor to play Biotic into 4 advancements right now. I can afford to wait for 1 turn. I'm not going to lose next turn. Also, I think, yeah, I don't know about that. So I get a single R&D access. It fails. I'm going to sneak door right here. Very tempting to use turning wheel here, but no, I'm just going to get a single access because I know I'm going to run twice. So 2 accesses should give me any agendas that he has drawn. Unfortunately, that's not the case. My opponent gets the Adonis off. Okay, so they're going to be rich. This is a big problem. And hedge fund doesn't help either. So yeah, game is hard. Now there's a 4th piece of ice on R&D. This basically telegraphs that my opponent doesn't have agendas in hand. Or if they do, they just drew it. So yeah, this is a very awkward situation. I can't freely sneak down archives because now my opponent has enough money to rush a Fash Out 3. I can't run R&D freely because there's too much ice I need to break. I can install Mongoose, actually, but that would leave me with too few cards in hand to run. So yeah, I don't think I can actually run this turn. And this is quite a big problem with Los. You just run out of tempo once the opponent gets 2 pieces of ice on every server, and you can't keep the pressure up every turn. So because of this, my opponent has the room to break R&D lock, and as you see here, score the 6th agenda point. My opponent scored 3 agendas in a row, and I couldn't do anything about it because my tempo was just not there. I'm down to 10 credits. Those 2 Temujins are running out. What can I do here? I'm going to run R&D first click with the R&D I already prepared from previous turns, and with the Aaron Marin counters from scoring the ABT, I'm able to get through this double architect server. That is a very annoying server to deal with for that matter. Even with Mongoose installed, I can't break all the architects with money. So this is a big problem, and Snake is waiting at the end of the server for me. Jeez, now I really wish I had a Mongoose out. This will cost me 1 card and a credit. You know what? I'm just going to go all in, right? I have 5 turning wheel counters. I have an R&D interface. I'll pitch the Mongoose, and I hope to win on this run. Seeing 4 cards. Turing. Vitruvius, there we go. Got it in the nick of time, but geez, my opponent got so close to winning themselves. That was no comfortable victory whatsoever. Now let's analyze the stats. I triggered Los 8 times and compromised employee 10 times. Los triggers fewer times because it only triggers once per turn. So in total, I managed to gain 24 credits between Los and the single compromised employee, which is actually really a lot. I'm actually quite impressed by how much money you get when starting as Los. So Yeah, I'm a bit of a convert now. I can definitely see a decent deck that starts out with Los as opposed to Andromeda. But the caveat is that you must run Sneak Door as an offensive option. No fewer than 3 copies. Even though the next 2 copies are dead, you can always pitch them to Faust as Faust food. This is again another big reason why I'm using Faust as my main breaker. Sneak Door is so good as you saw this game, I wouldn't have won without it. It gave me 5 agenda points on single Sneak Door accesses. That's how powerful it is. Of course, against a more competent opponent who expects a sneak door, I might have done less well, but the pressure is still there. Speaking of pressure, the latent threat of emergency shutdown allowed me to make 7 runs between R&D and archives, leveraging on the court being poor to bypass their ice. Criminals are not good at breaking ice. In fact, their breakers are super inefficient. What you really want to do, as I illustrated this game, is to make runs while your opponent's too poor to res ice. A lot of the times my opponent was on 4 or 5 credits, which gave me windows to sneak door past the Fairchild 3. This is huge. One way to counterplay as the call against Lowe's is to be rich. Surprise, surprise. And my opponent misplayed in that regard by aggressively scoring agendas and not focusing on the economy enough, giving me a lot of windows to run when they were poor. If you're rich enough, meaning that you have twice as much money to res your good ice, so say if Fairchild 3 is your threatening ice, you have 12 credits in your credit pool to res 2 Fairchild 3s, that's good. Because if they force you to res it once and then do a shutdown, you can still threaten the Fairchild 3 res again. And that's huge because this actually deters Lowe's from running, and by deterring a criminal from running, you are winning. My opponent aggressively scored Sales Team too many times, and while that gave him a lot of money to stay in the game, unfortunately, it also gave me a very prime window to play Exploit if I actually ran it in my deck. Of course I don't, because against competent players, I don't think Exploit is a good card at all. You probably will never have Exploit as an option, because a good player will defend the centrals well enough such that it's not possible to make 3 successful runs, especially not with my Breaker Suite, which relies on pitching cards. I can only start a turn with so many cards in hand. Playing an Exploit is very, very difficult. And early on, that's the best time to play Exploit because there are few ice, but when there are few ice, Exploit is also not very effective. So you have a horrible catch-22 there, and ultimately that just makes Exploit not that good, even though it seems to synergize the best with Los. So that's my analysis on this game. Do you agree? What do you think? Leave a comment in the comment section and I'll get to it. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and as always, happy net running. Goodbye. You want a competitive Pokemon? Well, I gave you competitive Pokemon. Happy now, viewers? Huh? If I switch to doing Pokemon commentary, you better stay subscribed to this channel. Or else.